7-7, solving quadratics using square roots. Remember that when you are solving a quadratic, what you are actually looking for are the x-intercepts, which are also called zeros, roots, or solutions. So today we're learning another method for finding the x-intercepts, and this is called the square root method. Now, unfortunately, this one only works when you can just see one x in your problem, so it's not always useful, but if it does happen, it makes your problems much easier. So here's one thing that we need to talk about. When you take the square root of a number, like the square root of 9, the answer is 3 because 3 times 3 equals 9. That's the definition of a square root. But don't forget that double negatives also multiply together to give me positive 9. So really, when we take the square root of something, we actually have two answers. We've got a positive 3 and a negative 3. And this little plus or minus sign just represents those two different answers. So the first thing that we're going to have to do on all of these problems is to solve for x squared, just like we used to back in the day whenever we were doing all of those solving equations. So for this first one, if I'm trying to get the x squared by itself, when there's not a number attached to it, so there's a sign between the letter and the number, you're using the opposite operation to move it to the other side. So I would move it over, and now I've got x squared is equal to positive 121. We're not finished with that, but we're going to come back to it. On this one, the negative 2 is attached to the x squared, which means that they are multiplied. So in order to undo multiplication, we are going to divide both sides by negative 2. And when you divide, you take signs with them. When you add or subtract, you're using the opposite signs. You divide, you keep the sign. So negative 162 divided by negative 2 gives me positive 81. We're also not finished, but we're going to come back. Now in example number 3, I've got plus 49 on the same side as my x squared. So on this one, I'm going to subtract 49 from each side. So that gives me negative 49 right there. Okay. Example number 4, now we're having some two-step equations going on. If I'm trying to get x squared by itself, the number that's attached is the boyfriend-girlfriend. The one that's not attached, like there's a letter or a sign between them, that's the friend. At the end of the day, you want to move the friend over first. So 4x squared is equal to 100. Now x squared is not completely by itself yet, so I would still need to divide both sides by 4 because that number was attached to my x squared. And now I've got x squared equals 25. Okay. Do another example like that one. Here's another two-step equation. The friend is the one that's not attached, so that's the one that we need to move first. So I've got 7x squared equals 175. Now from here, I still need to divide both sides by 7 to finish getting the x squared by itself, and I've got x squared equals 25. One more. The 9 is attached to the x squared, so I'm going to divide both sides by 9, and I get x squared equals 5. So now at this point, I'm going to add in the new step. Whenever you are to have something squared, if you want to undo squaring, you are taking the square root. They are the opposites of each other. So if I take the square root of this side, the square root of something squared just gets rid of that exponent. So now I've got x equals. Now, if you do something to the left side of the equal sign, you also have to do it to the right. The square root of 121 is positive and negative 11. You do have to have that little plus or minus sign because we actually do have two answers when we take a square root. So on the next one, I've got x squared by itself. Now I can take the square root of both sides, and I've got x is equal to plus or minus 9. If you look at example number 3, when I try to take the square root on this one, we actually end up with no solution because you cannot take the square root of a negative number. If I do the square root of negative 49, look what my calculator says, non-real answer. And here's the reason why. Because if I multiply 7 times 7, that's positive 49. If I multiply two negative 7s together, that's also positive 49. The only way I could get that is to do negative 7 times 7, which does give me negative 49, but those two things are not the same number. And the definition of a square root is what number times itself gives you that number. All right. So on example number 4, I've got x squared by itself. I take the square root. Now I've got x is equal to plus or minus 5. Same thing here. I take the square root. X equals plus or minus 5. And on the last one, the square root of 5 is not going to be a pretty number. It's going to be a decimal. It does exist because it's not a negative number, but we're just going to have to round to two decimal places. So on this one, x is equal to plus or minus 2.24. I want you to round to 2 decimal places. The way that you know if that number needs to stay a 3 or change to a 4 like mine did is by the number that comes right after it. If that third number right there is 5 or higher, then the one right before it needs to go up. So now it's 2.24. Now I recommend pausing the video and doing the first side of the assignment before you move on to the next.